else. Mr. Everybody, come on up here.
Good morning, Mr. President, members
Morning,
of Council. I'll provide a very short overview and then I'll yield to others to provide an overview. So Council may remember this from the March 22nd meeting where staff provided an update on the Ordinance. And just to recap the chronology, the Ordinance for the resource buffers was introduced on October 12th of last year, and then the P&Z hearing was on November 4th of last year. And then on December 16th of last year, P&Z made their recommendation to approve the Ordinance subject to recommended modifications. County Council held its first public hearing on January 11th and left the record open until the meeting of February 22nd, so it was a continuation of the public hearing. And then at the hearing of February 22nd, Council closed the public record, and that led to staff bringing it back for an update on March 22nd. And then prior to the closure of the record, staff had circulated electronic copies of over 200 comments that had been received and circulated, and the last update was on March 22nd. Unless there's any comments or questions for me, I'm going to yield to Mr. Robertson and Mr. Medlaws and others. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitehouse. So what we did, just to follow up with what Jamie just mentioned, we sort of took all that feedback and then incorporated into a form of a draft ordinance. And that draft ordinance is based upon the ordinance that was circulated way back when that incorporated those P&Z recommendations. We wanted to get you a full draft of the ordinance so you would know what it looked like with all these various changes that we've recommended. Having said that, I think that's good for informational purposes. When you all act on it, which I'm asking won't be today because we're going to have to go through a laundry list of motions, each one of these changes you're going to have to vote on up or down because there's going to be a separate almost line item motion for these changes. So we're going to go through these, and I'm not saying that you need to accept them or reject them. Just know that you'll have an opportunity to accept or reject them when we come back with those motions for us to go through. Having said that, I just want to go through what the changes are. We tried to do it not necessarily in the legal ordinance format, but more in a more easily understandable format by highlighting things in red that we've added to this most recent version. And I'm just going to run through those for your benefit and for the benefit of the public that's following this. The first one that we did is in our current code in Chapter 99, there's a requirement that if there are wetlands on the site, there has to be a notice in the deeds. We just expanded that, and we had talked about this along the way, but we expanded that existing requirement to reference that notice has to now incorporate the fact that if there are resources and resource buffers on a site, in addition to wetlands, which is the current requirement, just that notice has to be within the deeds and the restrictive covenants, and that there's the possibility that if there is a disturbance of the resource or the resource buffer, that may result in a violation of the code and the penalties, which are in the ordinance, which we'll get to in a moment. So that just expanded an existing requirement of our code. The next is, it's in Section 6. This actually has to do with information to be shown on the final site plan for subdivisions. There's a corresponding section at the end of the ordinance that deals with final site plans for RPCs and conditional uses. But we added in there, and this came with some discussion in previous conversations, the requirement that the boundary of the resource shall be marked on the site itself with permanent markers and signage with the location and type of signage depicted on the final plat. Is
that on line?
Line 335 on the version that I'm working from, Mr. Schaefer. It's repeated again in a couple other places too.
Yeah, 673 on that.
Yeah.
1069, 1068.
Yeah, and I had it at 689. The upland edge of all resource buffers shall be clearly marked with permanent in-ground markers and signage located at 100-foot intervals. Such signage shall be at least 5 inches by 7 inches in size. So it's just sort of saying on the final site plan, you got to show where these signs are located and what they're going to look like. And then later on is the actual requirement for the signage. And I'll tell you, there's no science to those dimensions. It was kind of staff's consensus on that. Frankly, the 100-foot intervals came from looking at the typical width of lots within cluster subdivisions. And 100 feet, that would be basically 1 every 2 lots. That way, the idea would be that no matter where you are in a subdivision, you'd be able to see one of these signs. The 5x7 came from just examples that we didn't want it to be too obtrusive, but we wanted it to be large enough that people would see it. And I don't know if you've been In my experience on golf courses, sometimes you see those as far as wetland areas, 5 by 7, and it says what they are and what you can and can't do. But that way they would be permanent type markers. What we didn't want to do was dictate this is what the sign has to look like, with specificity, because we wanted to note that there's a resource and a resource buffer, but at the same time we also realized that developments may have common themes with their signage throughout that development or whatever that they wanted to follow. The main thing was on line 635, you tell us what it's going to look like and we'll make sure it's okay. So,
And the permanent markers are at every corner?
no, they would be at the 100-foot intervals as well. And this was a conversation we had with Mr. Medlars, because the wetlands and the resources, particularly the wetlands and the resources, they're not straight lines, and we didn't want to burden somebody with having to put a marker every time that line, moves. We wanted to just be able to generally note where that line was on the site, because otherwise, it would almost be a fence in some cases, because the way the river or stream goes, it would be impossible.
I just have a comment that I'm not opposed to delineating the wetlands and posting them, but there is a cost incurred in doing all this.
Right.
As we struggle to keep cost of housing down, we continue to put on layers of government, and more government usually means more cost.
Right.
And I just think that might be a little overkill every 100 feet, but
Well, as I said, the 100 feet wasn't so much set in stone. That was sort of a starting place, and it may be 200 feet. I don't know what the right number is, but maybe Mr. Medlars can shed some light.
Councilman Schaefer, the discussion was between signage and monumentation. Signage being a non-legal, enforceable, no meets and bounds associated sign. A monument is a sign a monument which would be tied in meets and bounds wise to a survey. So I envisioned that each property would have corner monumentation anyway. And you remember, most of these properties will be backing up to a resource buffer, which means one of these monumentations could be picked up as a corner of a parcel property, or it could be what we call point on line. So the additional cost for that monumentation is literally the placement of the monumentation, not sending somebody out in addition to. So I feel that is a reasonable expectation. Obviously, the signage is something you don't have today, completely new. You have to buy the signs, you have to place the signs. But the monumentation, in terms of the legal sense, it's an add-on to your survey for the lot. That's what it is.
Thanks, Mr. Medlars. And then so we just talked about sort of the next one in line, which has to do with those monuments and signage and the location and the dimensions of them. The next change was within resource buffer width averaging. This is at line 698. We changed that based on feedback we got, that the averaging can only occur within resource buffers adjacent to the same resource to adjust that required Zone B resource buffer. So the averaging, if you have multiple different resources on a site, the averaging can only occur close to the same resource. It couldn't be spread out all over the site, within different resources. And so that's restated then at line 718. Moving into the table 2, resource buffer activities by zone, there was some clarifications on here. I know we got some feedback from some professionals who deal with soils and water bodies. And so we clarified some of the language on that. One of those was to state that walking trails where any impervious area runoff is managed under a Sussex Conservation District permit that are perpendicular to the resource. In other words, if you have the resource running this way and you have the path going this way to get to the resource, that is permitted in both Zone A and Zone B. And so that clarifies that that's permitted in both cases. And then if you get to the end of that table, line 24, or item 24, the same thing, but these are trails that run generally parallel with the resource. They're not permitted in Zone A, but they are permitted in Zone B. I don't think that's a vast change from where we were when we started. It just sort of clarifies the language on that.
And I got a question on
Riley?
averaging.
And I guess the question is, we've seemed to go back and forth on this a little bit, but, I mean, are there any of these options that would end up resulting at the end of the day of buffer widths and new developments being actually less than they currently are today? Because there seems to be some feedback that, in some cases they could be eliminated, or even, maybe at 25 feet, whereas today we're at 50 feet. So the pushback was, at the end of the day, this section may actually end up weakening our current ordinance. Can we clarify that once and for all? Because my impression was, or my request, and we were reviewing all this, was that in no case should buffers be less than 50 feet. We can negotiate the second 50, that's fine, but in no case, in my opinion, should they be less than they currently are.
Medlars or whoever.
I can attempt to answer Councilman Riley's question. And it cuts to the existing buffers today versus proposed buffers under option arrangements, not averaging. You sort of jumped ahead of the options, but
I wanted to get this question in. I wasn't sure if this was the right place to do it, but
it's related.
it's related.
It's related. So there is a scenario, and that scenario would come into play if you have a stream without being a designated tax ditch with right-of-way associated and or without associated wetlands. Now, that is a very rare animal in Sussex County. I'm not saying they don't exist, but there are very few and far between. So I have reached out to the University of Delaware, to a gentleman who is very familiar with the GIS world, and he and I compared some notes on this particular issue. And I would be ready to, would be prepared to share this in more detail with you, actually on a, area by area, watershed by watershed basis, if you wanted to know that. But we would put this in the single percentage realm. So there's about, in the low single percentage, there are streams which happen to be not tax ditches, which big right-of-ways associated. Because remember, if we have a tax ditch designation, the right-of-way will in most cases be larger than the buffer, and the right-of-way associated with the tax ditch will govern. And secondly, if there is a wetland associated with the stream, then that will govern. But in the rare instance where neither of these applies, you are correct.
And I'm going to take it a step further, because recall that currently there's no buffer from non-tidal wetlands. And so in the example that Mr. Medlar described, most every situation there are non-tidal wetlands which has a buffer on it that's required, and you can't average away. So we're always in those situations going to have a buffer that doesn't currently exist in our code.
But I was just only referring to existing code for streams, because our existing code does not have buffer for wetlands and does not recognize the tax ditch right-of-ways as buffers. So in this rare instance where you have just a stream with nothing else, you are correct.
Well, they do exist. I mean,
They do exist.
there's plenty. We were looking at one a couple weeks ago for potential property to acquire. And I just wonder if there should be some specific language in the ordinance that, explicitly says in no case shall the buffer be less than 50 feet. If that, because that's our goal, I think. Because if we build a development and you have, maybe you're adding to the buffer upstream, for example, but that development now is much closer to the resource. Is that what we're trying to accomplish?
I thought maybe I'm confused. I thought you just said today in our code There is no buffer on this,
That's,
none,
on non-title.
on non-title, and we're putting a buffer.
but if, Mr. President, what Councilman Riley said,
So I want to understand this. I mean, I want to be clear on what we're
what
discussing.
Councilman Riley was mentioning is a 50-foot number. Today, it's 0. In the future, it will be 50. But if you say never less than 50, now not only is any and all optioning out of the window, it's also any and all averaging is out of the window. Once you move this minimum 50 number in there, it becomes it's a fixed target.
And let me, we're dancing around a couple of different topics here. I want to be absolutely clear to Mr. Riley's initial question. Is there an opportunity, as the ordinance is written today, to have a buffer that is developed less than 50 feet on perennial non-tidal rivers and streams? The answer to your question is yes. Now, Mr. Medlars went forward to say it's probably rare because most non-tidal rivers and streams in Sussex County have associated wetlands on the outside of it. So where you're going to have a natural buffer because of those wetlands that adjoin the rivers and streams. But it's not an absolute. It is absolutely not an absolute. It could happen.
I just want to make sure that we are, if we're going to do buffers, I want to make sure the buffers are going to end up being in practice what we are envisioning in the ordinance.
That's not really creating a loophole, though. That's a rare instance where that might occur, that you don't have those wetland areas.
And I would add one thing, too. We're not eliminating, we're not saying that you're eliminating that square footage of buffer. It's averaging. So if it's, in Zone A, it's always going to be the required amount of Zone A. In Zone B, if you're reducing at some point, you're gaining at some other point on that same resource, because that's one of the changes we proposed, so that it has to be within that same resource.
So A always is there.
A will always be there.
And that's 50 feet.
No,
Well, it depends on the type of resource.
depends on the resource.
Right.
On the rivers and streams example, we're talking about non-tidal perennial rivers and streams. That's 50-foot total buffer, 25 and 25.
525.
The first 25, Zone A, it's untouchable. We've not done anything that allows Zone A to be touched. Zone B could be reduced, so that's where you go from 50 down to something between 50 and 25 in Zone B.
In a nutshell, your question was to perennial rivers and streams. As I said, I'd like to share with you, this is in the single digits. It does exist. It would potentially go in this rare examples, it would go from today required 50 to potentially 25. That is the case. But that's I'd like to share that data with you so you get a better feel for it.
But if it goes to 25 in one location, it also is going to be 50 in
No,
another.
remember he asked in general.
Right.
Under the buffering, it will always stay, but under the options, it could go to different locations. The area will never change. There's only one instance where the area changed for forest preservation.
Right. So the total area doesn't change, but where the area is the question, because if you're pushing a development closer to the resource, yes, you're saving other areas, but the development's still closer to the resource.
Never less than 25.
Because Zone A is always there, but you can have a reduction in Zone B possibly on a rare instance.
And I guess jumping further, because we are into the options, which is subsection G, one of the things that's recommended in here is that on those options, we take out the reference to Zone A. So you can't utilize the option for Zone A with any of these. It would only be Zone B. Because in the previous versions, you're correct, that Zone A was in play. Now it's not.
So we're saying never less than 25 feet.
We can categorically agree with you, never less than 25.
And currently there is no requirement.
There is no requirement on non-tidal wetlands. There is a requirement on streams not associated with a taxed right-of-way or wetlands.
And that requirement today is
50.
50. So in some instances, we could be reducing from 50 down to 25. Yeah, I'm wondering if we want to do that.
Councilman, it truly would affect a minimal number of potential applications. There's, as I said, you really, a picture is worth 1,000 explanations by the county attorney and the county engineer.
Mr. Madlars, any idea when you'll get that information from?
Ms. Nerba said it would be uploaded to the county website for the viewing on a layer this week.
Okay.
We already have the tax ditch right-of-way layer.
Right.
So you can already overlay this one. The other one will be available by the end of the week.
How well do tax ditch right-of-ways function as a buffer?
You remember when they move from the undeveloped to the developed world, they can no longer be farmed because there's a change in our proposed language which prohibits agricultural use after development. So this means, at a minimum, this buffer will either be planted as a meadow or as a forest.
Were you talking about tax ditch easements though?
Yes, no, but that's exactly what it
Yeah,
becomes.
yeah.
You can have a forest and a tax ditch.
Yeah, no,
No.
it's a maintenance easement.
We have plenty of forests and tax ditch easements.
You probably do, but.
We
yeah.
do.
That's supposed to be right, yeah.
No, in the easement.
Yeah.
But they have the access requirements under the new ordinance. So whether it becomes a meadow or a forest, we still have the access issues which are spelled out in the maintenance plan.
Okay.
So with regard to the options, there's been some significant changes to those, and this is subsection G. One, as I said, is we eliminated the options on any of these from applying to Zone A. The other big one was that we said, and if you look at the top of page 9, that the options can only be used for those resource buffers adjacent to perennial non-tidal rivers and streams, non-tidal wetlands, and intermittent streams. What that means is that the options cannot be utilized for resource buffers that are adjacent to tidal waters or tidal wetlands. And I know that was a big concern that I think several people spoke about, that they didn't want those G options to be sort of more wide open, so we limited them to just the perennial non-tidal rivers and streams, non-tidal wetlands, and intermittent streams.
And the B buffer.
Yeah, and the B buffer, that's right. One thing we changed in here, and it's more of wordsmithing, it previously stated, talked about the reduction of the perimeter landscape buffer required by Chapter 99. Previously it said like zone land, and in consultation with Mr. Medlars, what we wanted to be more clear about on that was that it was residential development adjacent to other residential development, whether that's a subdivision, residential planned community, or residential conditional use. So that doesn't change what it said, it changed how it said that provision. And then the sort of the off-site options, which start at line 841, same thing, we changed those so that they can only be utilized for non-tidal, perennial non-tidal rivers and streams, non-tidal wetlands and intermittent streams. So again, not tidal waters or tidal wetlands. And again, in there, eliminated the possibility of using those options in Zone A. If you recall, that's one of the things that we heard about from several people, and I know Senator LeBays, I think, and maybe Sarge gave examples of concerns that through the options you could reduce the buffer completely, so there was no buffer next to a resource. Now there was always going to be at least a Zone A, and there's always going to be under the options Zone A or B, subject to averaging, next to tidal waters and tidal wetlands. So we won't ever have that situation where the buffer is completely eliminated next to a resource.
If I may. Whoever was following the Center of the Inland Bays meeting yesterday on the improvement plan implementation will have heard that the center is strongly supporting regional projects regional naturalization projects, which we have partnered, the county has partnered with them on numerous ones, several on their current rapid plan. Now, they also stated yesterday they are very much struggling to find partners for these projects. So I think if you look at this in the big picture, what the center wants to do and what maybe somebody can come around and say, hey, we can use any of the options to create some of these projects, that is a good synergy. So I think we should look at that from a much more global standpoint for Sussex County versus a narrower standpoint of this ordinance.
I mean, I understand the motivation behind, what you're trying to accomplish here. I just, well, 25 feet is certainly better than what I had pictured. So we'll talk about that, I guess.
And then again, if there's an off-site buffer, for example, one that's across the stream from the development, we just clarified that if that area is preserved as Zone A with a conservation easement, it cannot be used for agricultural purposes. It kind of would defeat the purpose of having it as Zone A if it can still be farmed. So that was just clarification of that. So,
and that's the same thing which applies to the taxage easement, because they cannot be continued to be used as farmland.
And then there's the violations and penalties. This has been substantially reworked from what we presented. Thanks. Don't go too far. From what we presented, I think, back in March. And this is the new subsection K, which is in section 11. It starts at the top of page 34. And so this is sort of the revised version of what we talked about. Basically, we came up with a better fine structure of $10,000 per quarter acre of disturbance or part thereof. So, that obviously increases the more disturbance there may be, the greater the fines there might be. The second thing is that there is a requirement that there be a mitigation plan submitted to and approved by the director with tree replacement requirements. And there's specifics in here about what it is if you remove one tree, then what the size is of the trees that you have to replace. And those are based on engineering standards that the county engineering department has currently.
That is the same standard we use in our easement agreements. We've used dozens of times. If the county disturbs trees of certain size, we either offer to pay for the tree, and we have an established value, or we replant it with 3 trees of that standard.
Okay. Mr. President, I have a question specifically about that. How will we ever know, or how do you ever inventory the trees that were removed? If they've been removed and discarded, how do you know they were of 6 inches in caliper size, and whether they were or whether they weren't?
Are you asking before or after acceptance of that phase of the development?
I guess it would have to be before.
Before, it's relatively easy because boots are on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
The line is delineated for the clearing,
Mm-hmm.
the limit of disturbance line, as well as the buffer line. So, which means any removal would be relatively visible to the daily boots on the ground the engineering department has. So it becomes more difficult after the phase is accepted. The engineering department inspection team leaves, daily inspection is no longer present. The building section inspections start, and the zoning inspections start. Mm-hmm. So that is more a non-daily. At that point, Mr. Whitehouse, you want to chime in? What would happen after that?
That's kind of, I guess that's where I'm going is after. If they go in there and cut, how do we monitor that, and how have we inventoried the trees before?
So we encounter this question today. If someone was to cut down a tree to down development, and we have a mitigation plan, in fact we have one we're working on at the moment, when we go out and we inspect, the stump is normally visible. It's unlikely someone would cut a tree especially a mature tree, and remove the stump simultaneously. Yes, it can happen, but almost in every case, there's evidence of the diameter of the tree that's been cut and the location of the tree, and enough for one of our inspectors and constables to get out and take a photo. So we encounter this problem at the moment, but normally you can see the stump. So.
Okay.
And the interesting part, Jimmy, is in the world of the phase under construction, the clearing and grubbing does just that. It is different from the tree cutting. It means cutting and grubbing, which means tree and stump are gone.
No, absolutely.
So that's why I said, because we're there every day, it would be very visible if somebody goes beyond the limit of disturbance, which in the future has to be demarcated. So
Okay.
I was not sure what would happen. So between the two explanations, hopefully we addressed your question.
And that's just, it's a tough thing to do, but we just got, this is my area, violations and penalties.
And ultimately, that's going to be part of the mitigation plan that's going to come through. I mean, they're going to submit, there's going to be inspections that have occurred. They're going to, either side, engineering and planning and zoning, are going to have data that they've accumulated in terms of what was there and what's been removed, and that's going to then be distilled down into the mitigation
Okay.
plan. So there is some flexibility there, too.
Okay, and I noticed that the fines have been dropped
The fines.
somewhat, and I specifically wanted to make sure that, in the last hearing, that I want these fines to hurt.
Well,
If
and that's
they're-
another one that we talked about. So we dropped it. They were one of the issues we had with the fines were in the previous discussion. They were big chunks. It was,
Yeah.
it was almost too much acreage for the amount of money that we were talking about.
Okay.
And it wasn't very well delineated. Now it's broken down into quarter-acre sizes. But also in conversation with staff, we talked about that the fines are important, but also it states that we're going to hold building permits, and that's going to be what's really important.
That's,
Be
yeah.
in compliance, right?
It's fine plus, not either or.
Right.
As long as it's plus.
It is, because it's worded now that it's and, so it's fines, mitigation plans, and holding the building permits until the rehabilitation is complete.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question on
Mr. Riley?
So the fine of $10,000 per quarter acre, is that a minimum or is that proratable? I mean, if they cut 100 square feet, for example, is it going to be 10,000 or is it going to be a prorated number?
The wording is a legal interpretation of part thereof, Mr. But it would part thereof is part thereof.
Yeah, so it's 10,000 if it's 100 square feet. Before, and I forget, I don't know what I don't have in front of me, but it was, it was 100 square feet,
I know,
100 acre. And then, so,
I mean, more than hurt them, we'd bury them. I mean,
Yeah, I don't want to do that. But I
Right.
just,
right.
I just want to be sure that they're playing by the rules.
Did that answer your question, Mr. Riley?
Yes.
Mr. Schaefer, you got a
I
question?
do. I got a call the other day relating to the withholding of building permits. And I made the analogy, and the gentleman who called me disagreed with me. He didn't think it was the correct analogy, that it's somewhat like the MOU with DelDOT, where if you don't perform in the time frame that they're requesting on, I guess it's primarily entrance improvements.
Yes.
That DelDOT can call up the county and say, hey, we want you to withhold building permits until the developer pays attention. And is that a correct analogy, or am I?
I think that's fairly correct. And also, we have the Clean Hands Ordinance in our code, too, which, says something similar. So if you're in violation of the county code, you can't apply.
You can withhold.
Yeah.
So it's really nothing that's
No.
brand new.
No.
Okay.
And actually, the code says now, and because one of the things that that I mentioned before, there was a concern that there were not penalties as part of this ordinance amendment. You have to keep in mind that this is an amendment to one section of our zoning code, and the zoning code also has its own penalties within it. And I think it's section 229 or something like that. It also says that you can withhold building permits, depending on the situation. So that was a long answer to your question, but this isn't something that's totally.
All right, well, that was my response, that this isn't something that was just invented here in the last couple of weeks. This has been going on in Sussex County for.
In all the different scenarios,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
So that essentially summarizes the proposed changes. We wanted to get that back to you in an ordinance form so you could see them in context. As I said, I think what we'll do next, I think Mr. Bednar is going to get some information, it sounds like, about Mr. Riley's question. And then I think the next step is to be back before you with that sort of cafeteria list or menu of ordinances or of motions to make these changes that you all can determine.
Okay.
So,
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
thank you.
Let's try to get our grant request done, Ms. Jennings. We've got to get out of here at 11:30, so.